Good morning. I am really happy to be here with you this morning as your preacher. I've been a friend of your pastor, Charlie Rudd, for a lot of years. He and I attended seminary together almost 20 years ago now. Our years overlapped a little bit. It's an honor to be invited into this community to serve as your preacher, especially as I know how well and how faithfully your normal guy does his work. I've been assigned track 7 in your sermon series, God's Greatest Hits. Last Sunday, Pastor Babette Chapman opened up the book of Exodus. She started the story, and today we get to keep going. I'm tasked with taking the series a little bit further into the story that she started. I get to talk about Egypt and about Pharaoh and the plagues, the first of which you heard. Bonnie just read the story of the first plague. I get to talk about the struggle that God sets in motion and puts Moses right in the middle of, the work of wrestling God's people away from a tyrant's grasp and leading them to freedom and a future full of promise and possibility. It's a really rich story, it is. And I'm not going to be able to do justice to all that richness this morning, in part because it's hot and we'd be here a while, and in part because Pastor Charlie told me I was not allowed to preach for 5 hours today. He told me to keep it tight, so I'll try to do that. So I'll start with a short summary, as short a summary as I can muster of the story of Exodus. Generations ago, God's people had fled to Egypt from Canaan because of a famine. At that time, their ancestor Joseph became a friend of the Pharaoh, Egypt's ruler. They were welcomed. They were made a home along the Nile, but time passed. Those elders died, and a new ruler arose. And this Pharaoh saw the Hebrews not as friends, but as an existential threat to his nation. And this Pharaoh decided that making Egypt great again would start with putting the Hebrews to work as slaves. Later on, he even tried to control the population by ordering all the Hebrew boy babies to be thrown into the river for the crocodiles to eat. And the people, God's people, were scared. They were sad as they suffered under Pharaoh's oppressive policies, as they built his pyramids and harvested his grain and kept watch over his flocks. And their cries found their way to God's ears. And God heard them. God remembered the promises God had made to those ancestors, promises of a future, promises of a home. God remembered that God cared. God cared about what happened to these people. God remembered that God loved these people. And so God acted. With signs, with wonders, God pried the chosen people from Pharaoh's stubborn grip. God led them miraculously through the sea into the wilderness, and for 40 years walked beside them as they struggled to shed the shackles of their slavery, as they struggled to learn how to be free people. That's the story. And we can call it track 7 of your summer preaching series if we like, but this really is the greatest hit when it comes to the Hebrew Bible. This story is the core of Jewish identity and Jewish theology. This is the one that our Jewish sisters and brothers are obliged to remember and to retell every year at Passover. This story, this one reminds them of what's at the absolute center of their faith, center of their identity as a people. It reminds them of who they are, and it reminds them of whose they are. It reminds them what the God who claims them and loves them and defends them and protects them and frees them is like. This God, whom they know as Yahweh, hears. This God attends to the cries of suffering human beings. These things not only reach this God, God's ears, but apparently they also matter to this God. They matter to this God's heart. This God has a heart. And this God's heart is moved by love and fidelity to this enslaved people. And so Yahweh chooses to intercede against injustice and bring about liberation. God hears, God cares, and God acts. That's probably the simplest way to tell this story. And what it lacks in juicy detail, I believe it makes up by being fairly easy to remember. God hears, God cares, God acts. God hears, God's paying attention to what's happening in the world. And what's happening in the world matters to God. God cares about how things are playing out. And God is especially concerned how those without power are doing in every situation. The poor, the widow, the stranger, the sojourner, the immigrant. God cares how rulers and the rich steward the gifts of the land and the power that comes with leadership. And God acts. God steps towards the creation. In the Hebrew Bible, this acting usually involves the person of a prophet, someone who has been empowered and anointed by God to deliver a message, and sometimes even to underscore that message with a work of wonder or a demonstration of power. We see this in judges like Deborah and Samson, and prophets like Elijah and Isaiah and in Jeremiah, and today we see it in Moses. God acts through people to bring down the mighty and uplift the lowly, to free captives and scatter enemies, to restore humanity and rebalance community. God hears, God cares, God acts. It's a pattern in the Bible. And once you notice it, it's really hard to stop seeing it. You see it everywhere. See it in Paul's letter to the Philippians today. You see it echoed in the psalm. And if this were a Bible study, we could have a really good time together using this frame. God hears, God cares, God acts. We could use this frame to look at not just the Exodus story. We could do other stories. We could open up the New Testament. That's a whole new playlist, though. The greatest hits from a different volume. Maybe that's next summer's sermon series. Maybe that's this fall's Bible study. I don't know. But I know that this right now isn't a Bible study. As much as I would like to be your teaching theologian, I'm your preacher. It's a sermon, and in sermons, we can't just read the Bible. We also have to let the Bible read us a little. We have to let the story investigate us and our times. And as we do, we hope God's word will find its way through this story into our lives. So in the time that we have left, I can't just keep talking about how God hears and how about God cares and about how God acts. I need to point out that the tale that's told in this old book isn't as clean as the cool theological frame I just offered you. God, you see, is not the only one in the story who hears, who cares, and who acts. There's another force at work in our text. If the big picture of Exodus tells us some true things about God, I believe some of the details on the ground, especially the particular way Pharaoh is portrayed, I believe that these details have something to say about you and me, about those of us who are not God, even though we sometimes would like to be. There's a darkness in this story. I wonder if you noticed it. There's a real mess in this story. And it has to do, I think, with Pharaoh's hard heart. You heard it a moment ago. Then Yahweh said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. See, Moses had already been to Pharaoh once. He's given God's message. He's made God's demand. Pharaoh has heard from God's prophet. He's aware that there is this rival deity making a claim on a group of people whom Pharaoh sees as his own property. That's how it worked in ancient Egypt. The Pharaoh owned everything. The Pharaoh owned everyone. The land, its produce, the people and their labor, all the wealth, all the power. And Egypt, by the way, at this time, was the most powerful and the wealthiest nation on earth. It had existed by the time of Moses for nearly 2,000 years already. Pharaoh hears God's prophet. He just doesn't care. Pharaoh can hear, but his perception is clouded. He believes what his people believe about him, what his people say about him, that even if he's not quite a god in the technical sense of the term, he's certainly more than human. He's certainly more human than these Hebrews. Pharaoh doesn't care about a word from some god with a nonsense name in the mouth of one of his slaves. Pharaoh's passion is attached to his power, to his pride, to his nation. Pharaoh cares about protecting and perpetuating his place at the top of that pyramid. Pharaoh cares about Pharaoh. So Pharaoh hears. Pharaoh doesn't care. Pharaoh acts. Pharaoh acts by refusing to budge. Pharaoh acts by pitting himself against God's will for liberation. And the Bible shorthands all this to the image of a hardened heart. You and I live, I think, in an unfortunate era, in a place and a culture that seems to admire and reward hard-heartedness, although we don't typically call it that. Usually gets described as pragmatism or realism or austerity or a warrior mindset or a CEO mentality. Some will say that soft hearts are a sign of weak wills and weepy indecision. Hard times need hard hearts. That's lamentable for many reasons, not least of which is all the human and the non-human suffering that it creates and condones. And this is what happens in the story about Pharaoh. The first plague was blood. Moses struck the Nile and the river. Egypt's lifeline was suddenly undrinkable. The poor Egyptians were forced to dig for muddy water in shallow wells. And Pharaoh didn't care about that either. He called it fake news, a trick, nothing but a hoax exposed by the fact that his magicians could do the same thing. There are 10 plagues in total. 9 follow this first one. The Bible calls them wonders, but they're not wonderful, they're terrible. After the blood came an infestation of frogs that covered the land, then clouds of gnats or lice, depending on the translation, then swarms of flies, then all the livestock belonging to the Egyptians dies in the fields, the cattle and the sheep and the goats. They drop dead and they start to stink. Then boils and blisters appear on the skin of the Egyptians. Then hailstones batter the land. Then a storm of locusts. Then 3 days of darkness so deep and so thick that no one could see a thing. And finally, death. Every firstborn son or daughter or animal alive in Egypt is cut off from the land of the living. 10 plagues, each one more horrible and destructive than the previous. And afterwards, after every one, Pharaoh doubles down, hardens his heart, refuses to relent, even as his kingdom and his people crumble around him. It takes 10 rounds to bust through Pharaoh's hard heart, 10 rounds of increasingly dire ecological and human catastrophes to convince this ruler of one nation that he is not the one who holds the whole world in his hands. 10 rounds of utter chaos to return Pharaoh to the fact of his own humanity, to set God's people free. And even then it's tenuous. Even then, Pharaoh sends his mighty army to chase the fleeing Hebrews into the sea. What's it going to take, Pharaoh? Flannery O'Connor wrote, it does not take much to make us realize what fools we are, but the little it takes is a long time coming. What will it take for you and me, I wonder? What will it take for us? What's it going to take before we hear, before we care, before we act? How many more years of warming must we endure before we realize our economic systems, our ways of living and being on this planet aren't sustainable? How many more species will we lose from this earth before we notice we can no longer breathe or eat? How many floods or fires or famines before we care, before we act? Is it harder to break a heart or a habit? How many wars over water or land or borders or oil until our hard hearts finally open? What's it going to take to return us to our common humanity, to our role as stewards of a good creation, as neighbors? What's it going to take to get us to set each other free? Jesus tells a story in our gospel this morning. It's a short one. A rich man reaped a wondrous harvest. His land produced abundantly. He has more than he needs, more than he knows what to do with, more than he even has space for. And we hear him talk to himself. I know what I'll do. I'll pull down all my old barns and I'll put up new ones, bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods, all my stuff. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have enough laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. Pharaoh cares about Pharaoh. And in Jesus' parable, God speaks, you fool. This very night your life is being demanded of you, and these things that you have prepared, whose will they be? Again and again in the Bible, God demonstrates a preference for those who are hurting and judgment for the ones who hurt them. God is set against tyrants in all places and in all times, and this includes the wannabe Pharaoh who resides in the White House and the wealthy fool in Jesus' story who ignores the truth that he has neighbors. It also includes the tiny executive who makes his hard-hearted home in our heads. God hears. God cares. And God acts. Sometimes this simple message will sound like salvation, my friends. I hope it does for you. I hope you can hear it that way this morning, even a little bit. God hears you. God cares about you. God acts. God is acting even now, even this morning in this community of grace for you and for goodness for your life. And sometimes this truth about God, that God hears, that God cares, that God acts, sometimes it might sound scary or dire or cause discomfort. Pay attention to that. It's an indication that something near you or in you needs to change. Something or someone needs to be freed to follow the life God has promised, the life God has opened and is opening. And may our hearts be soft enough to see this. Amen.